Welcome to On the Middle East, Al Monitor's podcast on the big developments unfolding in the region. My name is Ambryn Zaman, and today I'll be looking yet again at Turkey's watershed elections that are due to be held on May 14th. Opinion polls continue to point to a tight race, making the outcome of the presidential and parliamentary polls difficult to call. Election security remains a big concern, and there is little doubt that Turkey's President Recep Tayyip Erdogan will stop at little to win. The largest pro-Kurdish bloc, however, dealt him something of a blow this week, declaring it would not field its own candidate for the presidential race. This in effect means the party will likely appeal to its base to vote for the opposition candidate, Kemal Kilicdaroglu. With us here today to discuss the latest picture is Merve Tahiroglu, Turkey Program Director for the Project on Middle East Democracy. Welcome to our program, Merve. It's so great to have you with us here today.
Hi, Ambryn. It's great to speak with you.
So, big news this week. The HDP finally announced that it would not be fielding its own candidate in the presidential elections that are going to be held on May 14th. That's also now confirmed. It's official. Is this really good news for the opposition? And if so, why?
I do think it's good news for the opposition. One thing that the opposition seems to be going for in this election is to make sure that at least in the presidential vote, that there won't be two votes, but they will be able to win the election in the first round. For that, they need to get, of course, more than 50% of the votes. And the worry it has been and is still that if there are multiple candidates running against Erdogan in the first round of the presidential election, one of those people, Erdogan might be able to reach past 50% and just capture the results in his favor in the first round, and that there may not be a second round, or that if there are too many candidates, no one might be able to get more than 50%, and there will be a second round of the election, in which case Erdogan could argue over the 2-week period before the second round that there shouldn't be a split vote, and the people should really elect him and mobilize his supporters and then win the election in the second round. So I think what the opposition wants is to be able to just end this in the first round. And with that, the common sense in Turkey at least seems to be that fewer opposition candidates will not divide the votes as much, and so the opposition candidate Kilicdaroglu would be able to win in the first round clearly. So I think the HDP not running its own candidate already means that they will be implicitly or explicitly supporting Kemal Kilicdaroglu, the leader of the other opposition grouping, and the traditional voters of the HDP will in fact support him in the first round, and that should boost his chances of winning in the first round.
But when we look at the poll numbers, it's still a very tight race. I mean, particularly when we're looking at the more sort of respected, established pollsters like, say, Metropole. And that's quite concerning. And even as Erdogan's party, the AKP, appears to be losing support, not dramatically, but some support in the wake of this earthquake, the CHP is not gaining support. And when we look at, Kilicdaroglu's own numbers, again, according to Metropole, he's polling 44% to Erdogan's 42%. Now, that's really tight. The other thing is, of course, some would argue that it's far easier to mobilize the HDP base if they have their own candidate running, that they're far more likely to go to the ballot box. And this is particularly true in the Southeast. People measure the HDP's influence over its base with the municipal elections in 2019. But that's not necessarily, giving us the full picture, really. We don't know how this would play out in the southeast. So there are people who say it would have been better, in fact, if the HDP did have its own candidate, if it did go to a second round, and in the second round then, and particularly if the AKP lost its parliamentary majority, again giving the opposition a psychological boost, here they are, they've denied him a majority, then of course the HDP in turn could tell its base, hey guys, now we have to go full force for Kilicdaroglu. What do you say to that, Merve?
So I think a lot will depend on how all of these parties, including the HDP now under the Green Party, will be campaigning, and how the campaign process will look like. I do think that the honorary and actual leaders of the HDP, and by honorary I of course mean Selahattin Demirtas, who has been in jail for a number of years now, but is still campaigning on behalf of the party. I think these people have a pull over their voters, and if they unequivocally support certain candidates like Kilicdaroglu, I do think that will have a huge impact on their traditional voters. I do think they can mobilize these voters to go out and vote in the first round. It does sound that the HDP is no longer running as its own party. It's not promoting its own candidate. All of these things could hurt the party, of course, and its voters, but I don't think it really will. I think people, especially the Kurdish voters, are so fed up with the Erdogan government and its failures over recent years, especially now with the closure case in the Constitutional Court facing the HDP. I think people are really angry with this government and really look at this election. And this is not just Kurdish voters. Everyone, I think, is looking at this upcoming election, as a make or break election in Turkey. I think for a lot of people, it's sort of the last hope that they have for an opposition win and for a change of regime towards a more democratic regime. And so the stakes are extremely high, higher than they have ever been in previous years. So I think that already has a psychological impact on voters. And, the HDP facing a closure case, I think, is making a lot of these tactical moves, in part to try to safeguard its political, presence in Turkey and establishment. So I think they're being smart, and I do think that they can get their voters in sizable numbers to vote in the first round of the presidential election and in the general election in general for the most successful looking opposition candidate out there, which is going to be CHP's Kilicdaroglu. But I don't even want to call him the CHP's leader anymore, because he really seems to be the leader of a broader opposition coalition. So I think, in this election, the stakes are very high, which makes all the dynamics different this time. I do have some worries about it, though, but we can talk about those, particularly regarding election security.
Yes, election security is a terribly important issue, and we will definitely talk about that. But before we do, I'd like to discuss the big elephant in the room, Abdullah Öcalan, the imprisoned PKK leader, who arguably has greater sway than any over the Kurdish base. Do you agree with that premise, for one? And do you believe that Erdogan may again resort to mobilizing İmralı, the island where he is, to get Öcalan to support him, as he tried during the municipal election, though that didn't go terribly well and was horribly mismanaged?
Yeah, this is a great question. So, of course, what Öcalan thinks, I think, does have a huge impact on Turkey's Kurdish population, especially for his supporters of his movement and ideology. That said, Erdogan, as you alluded to, has in previous elections tried to manipulate uh, statements coming out of Öcalan, out of the prison, in order to get Kurdish voters to basically not vote for the opposition or to support him or to stay in. I think the last time you tried to do this in the municipal elections in 2019, the statement that came out of Öcalan was so clearly seemed to be under duress and kind of cryptic. It was a cryptic message. He basically asked Kurdish voters not to split, the vote, not to pick a side between the opposition and Erdogan. But it was written in such an indirect manner. I think it was obvious for most people reading that message, hearing that message, that perhaps that's not exactly what he meant to say. And, this is a man who is not shy about making his opinions clear. I think the fact that he didn't come out and explicitly say support Erdogan or the AKP was a clear indication that he wasn't quite behind this particular message, but this was rather a message being put in his mouth by authorities to manipulate voters. And it didn't pan out the way Erdogan expected. People listened to HDP leaders, voters listened to HDP leaders' commentary and recommendations instead. And we saw a large group of voters support opposition candidates in those elections. So I think this time too, even if Erdogan tries to bring out a message from Öcalan calling on Kurdish voters to support him, I feel like it's going to fail once again, because as much as Öcalan has a pull on these voters, I think these voters are quite aware of the circumstances in which this man is being held and these kinds of messages are being manipulated, and probably won't fall for such machinations.
Well, that's certainly what I took away from my interviews in Brussels the week before last with Remzi Kartal and Zubair Aydar, both, leading figures in the Öcalan-led movement. And they were very clear that they, didn't see any scenario where either Erdogan would reach out to them or that they would support him. So I tend to agree with you, Merve, on that. Of course, there are other spoilers. We saw what happened with Meral Akşener, and even now we see members of her party sort of grumbling about the relationship between Kilicdaroglu and the HDP, which isn't really, at least on the face of things, much of one anyway. I mean, he went to visit them just recently, but has mostly kept them at arm's length. So does that spell trouble for the opposition bloc? Can we worry that some of Akşener's voters will either, boycott the election or perhaps even vote for the government? Then we also have Muharrem İnce, this firebrand populist who was the CHP candidate in the previous election, who's saying he will run, and according to certain polls has a 3%, 4%, which of course every vote counts. So again, doesn't that throw the whole idea of a first round win at risk?
Yeah, I mean, I think if you have more candidates like Muharrem İnce running and competing with Kılıçdaroğlu, I think that will divide the opposition vote, and it ultimately is a bad thing for the opposition's chances going to the election. But I think this is why the opposition bloc, especially the CHP, seems to be working really hard to try to convince İnce not to run separately, but to support Kılıçdaroğlu. And I think maybe I'm too optimistic, but I believe that they will be able to sway him ultimately and get him to just mobilize the supporters towards Kılıçdaroğlu instead of running separately. With the Akşener question, I honestly thought you were going to ask me if this would irk the Kurdish voters, but you asked me if the relationship with the HDP will irk Akşener's voters, the nationalist voters. I have to
Good
think about
point,
that. I
fair
mean,
point, Merve. Yes,
no,
yes.
no,
Okay.
you confused me by asking it that way. I think, look, this tension between Turkish nationalists and Kurdish nationalists has always been there. It's been there in every election. I don't think it's going to hurt the opposition's chances any more so than it has in previous elections. And by that, I mean, I don't think there's any new dynamics at play. I think these opposition voters in Turkey in general are really looking at this election again as a make or break thing. So, all of these tensions have always been there. They're nothing new. There haven't been no new incidents that maybe fuel these kinds of sentiments among either party. There's always going to be distrust, from the Turkish nationalists towards any kind of cooperation with the HDP or Kurdish voters, outreach to Kurdish voters coming from CHP. They're going to think, this is not something we'd like to see. Already, I'm seeing a lot of, messaging, particularly from government circles, saying that Kılıçdaroğlu is a PKK leader. He's the candidate of the PKK. He's the candidate of Kurdish nationalists. And then similarly, some, Kurdish politicians are looking at this saying, well, how can we trust this opposition grouping as long as someone like Meral Akşener is part of it? What if she ends up getting a post in an opposition-led government, a high cabinet post like interior minister? How will that change things for the Kurds? I think these are real questions for the Kurds to have. But at the same time, what I think this is an advantage for the opposition that Kılıçdaroğlu is running and not somebody else. I mean, he is the main face of the opposition grouping, and he is a much more softer candidate, a more palatable candidate for all sides. He's really someone who can speak to any of these factions and hopefully alleviate concerns. It's also important that, there's about 7 people campaigning alongside him. All of these, not just Akşener, but all of these other leaders of these opposition parties, but also the Istanbul mayor, which is going to help, diversify the opposition's message during the campaign period, which is, about to start officially. And, I think that's going to be an advantage in alleviating concerns of various factions of voters, which are real concerns. But at this point, what everybody is looking at is, and I think it's really smart that the opposition is not promising merely a set of policies that they would, undertake if they come into government, but they're actually proposing entirely changing the way the regime is functioning in Turkey, right? They're promising a change in the constitution to bring Turkey back into a strengthened parliamentary system. So giving more powers to the parliament, where all of these parties moving forward will have more power over the decisions that are made in government. They're promising a new system whereby the judiciary can be more independent, where media freedoms can be, well, there's no media freedom now, so we can have media freedom. All of these very basic fundamental things about how government functions in Turkey. And I think that's something ultimately this is, I think, during the campaign period, what the opposition needs to be emphasizing. The message they need to be emphasizing is, look, you may not like these individuals, us as individuals, you may not even like these parties that we're running together with and who's supporting us, but ultimately we are trying to change the system that will empower you moving forward, give you power as a citizen that you have not had in 10 years, in 20 years, according to some people, but really, functionally in 10 years. That I think needs to be what people are voting for in this election. Not for an individual, not for a particular party, not for an ideology, but for a more democratic future.
Yes, I completely agree with you. Of course, there is the problem of access, as you said. Erdogan controls most of the media. And again, as you said, he's going to do his best to sort of split away as many nationalist votes from within the CHP, the E party, drive a hard wedge using the Kurdish issue. That, I think, will definitely be the strategy he pursues. And whether he carries it to an extreme by, say, for example, attacking northeast Syria again, who knows? It depends really on how desperate he gets. And we do see some signs of desperation. That outreach to Hudapar, the Hezbollah offshoot, which he caused rancor within his own party. So many imponderables. But Merve, let's talk about election security.
Okay, I mean, I just quickly to add, yes, Erdogan will absolutely use this tactic of the wedge between, and the Kurdish issue, amping it up. I think I don't want to even think about the possibilities of what he could possibly do, how he could try to flare up these tensions. But again, he's done this now since 2015. I think people are quite fed up with it, and it seems to be not really working for him anymore. So, I'm not any more worried about it going to this election than I was in the last 3 elections that Turkey has had. And in fact, I think, he sort of overused that card to a point where it's no longer really working for him. The same thing with the, Islamist versus secularist divide. I think whenever he tries to bring up that issue to polarize the voters, in recent years, the power of these tactics have been receding, and I think it's not going to work in his favor, but he will definitely try. Now with election security, I think that's one of the biggest challenges going in, because these elections are definitely not going to be fair given the state of the media and the judiciary, and that the party like the HDP, second largest opposition party in Turkey, is facing closure. There's so many issues that there's no way we can call this election fair. I mean, that's already clear now going into it, but we can at least try to hope that it will be free. And by that, I mean, we won't see, on a mass scale, votes being manipulated, fraud on the actual day of the election and with vote counting. What worries me about the HDP question, HDP not running as a party in this one, but running under the aegis of the Green Party, is that, where in the southeast of Turkey, where we have HDP strongholds, those are the areas where in previous elections we have seen the most election fraud, quote unquote. So where we have seen the most instances of ballots being counted where they shouldn't be counted, ballot box stuffing, instances like that usually happens in these places where the HDP has more of a presence compared to other opposition parties. I think in the last general election in 2018, I heard that of the around 200,000 ballot boxes that are going to be functional in this upcoming election and were in the 2018 election, something like 11,000 ballot boxes, most of them concentrated, vast majority concentrated in the southeast, didn't show a single opposition vote at those boxes. So all of those votes, went to the AKP or the MHP parties. That means there were no observers present in those ballot boxes from opposition parties acting on behalf of opposition parties. That's really concerning, because if there were any, there would be at least one vote going for an opposition party. So that's quite concerning. If the HDP is not running as a party, it won't have an official mandate from the government to assign an observer from its party at these ballot boxes. So the other opposition parties, such as the CHP, need to take up that role, or volunteer-based organizations, NGOs like Oy Ötesi, Vote and Beyond, or Türkiye Gönüllüleri, this new group that has emerged now, that feels like they're going to have a big presence in terms of election monitoring. These organizations and these opposition parties need to take up that role and make sure that there are going to be observers at these locations in the southeast, where the HDP won't have too much control over what's taking place. They already haven't in the previous elections because of the high security measures that we see in a lot of these places, because of the, I guess, still ongoing war that the government has with the PKK. But it's particularly important, I think, in this election that, every single one of these ballot boxes, these precincts, have observers from opposition parties and independent observers present, in order to make sure that we don't see something like ballot box stuffing or mass voter fraud.
Well, Merve, that was a great conversation. Thank you so much for joining us here today, and I look forward to talking to you again after the elections.
Thank you, Amber. It's such a pleasure to talk to you.
And this brings us to the end of this week's On the Middle East. I hope you enjoyed my chat with Merve. She truly is brilliant, and I'm sure you agree. Thank you and goodbye.